Well, we're going to engage in a panel discussion which commences now. We are aware that we are about 10 minutes late, but this promises to be an invigorating conversation nonetheless, and we do want you to participate by sharing your thoughts and feedback in the chat as well as on the Q&A service. Our panel will focus on how best we can create and source solutions to tackling the challenge of youth unemployment. And for that, I'm joined by our panelists who are all joining us in studio. So at least it feels like a lot more interactive than a normal conference would be. But of course, again, we are cognizant and mindful and have observed all the COVID-19 regulations with respect to sanitizing, testing, as well as screening, as well as sanitizing. But allow me to introduce my panelists who join me in studio, all socially distanced on stage, as you can tell. Starting to my left, Sabelo Buthelezi, who's the Chief Director for Special Projects at the Department of Higher Education and Training. Followed by Dr. Anthony Giva. He is the Program Manager for National Business Initiative. Followed by the CEO of Yes for Youth, Tajmia Ismail-Saville. And joining us in the corner is the Chief Brand Officer of Harambee Youth Employment Accelerator, Kuben Nair. Lady and gents, thank you so much for joining us for this invigorating conversation. I think there are a lot of nuggets from Professor Ann Bernstein's presentation that we're certainly going to pull through into this conversation. And I think I want to start off with the two elements she highlighted: growth and reform. Both very difficult elements that seem intangible at the moment for South Africa to achieve from an economic growth point of view, where our forecasts are not quite where they should be in order to attain some of the previous financial and economic objectives we had, and reforms which certainly need a strong level of political will and significant change. Anthony, I'm going to throw this one into your corner. Firstly, do you agree with those particular recommendations? And most importantly, how do you see these unfolding in order to allow and facilitate for employment programs to be successful?
Well, I think there's different perspectives on how we look at growth and reform. I mean, in our work over the last couple of decades at the National Business Initiative, the key thing is how do you overcome this disconnect between the supply and demand for skills, because if you can't do that, it's very difficult to transition young people into employment. And we know that in the past we've made a number of mistakes, and kind of leading off what Anne has spoken about. One is that we've been very reliant on qualifications as the solution to our problems. That qualifications are the key lever to unlocking access to jobs. And what we've learned is that, in fact, that doesn't hold true in terms of the labour market. So that's the one side. The other side is that we've been very reliant on our large corporates to solve our skills and jobs crisis. And what we're obviously learning again is that our large corporates are not labour absorbing and are struggling, given the economic conditions as well as the effects of the pandemic, to really retain jobs, let alone create new jobs. So large corporates have been driven by your incentives to train young people through apprenticeships, through learnerships and other sorts of things. And these young people don't get employed at the end of it. So we spend a hell of a lot of money. It's very resource intensive, but it's also very limited. So it locks out a large number of young people in terms of access to the opportunities that can prepare them for the labour market. So what we need to try and start do is to dig a little bit beneath that and to understand, in the first instance, where are the jobs? And I think that's been something that we've been grappling with over the last couple of years, or the last few years, is to really understand where are the jobs is the first thing. And secondly, what are the kinds of skills and other types of support that young people need to be able to access those jobs? And I think on the first instance, if we're talking about growth, so when we look at the growth side of it, the growth of jobs is not going to happen in our large companies. The growth of jobs has to come through our SMEs. And the big challenge with SMEs is that they're also struggling to grow and they're also struggling to absorb labour. So we've got to help them. And I think that's partly speaks to what Anne was saying, is that we've got to help them to grow. And that particularly relates to our large number of SMEs that operate in our informal economy. Because in many of the industries that we work with, a large number of the businesses that we work with across the industrial economy operate in the informal sector. So how do we help? And they operate out of townships. So how do we help township-based and village-based businesses to overcome some of the hurdles to growth? To overcome some of the hurdles that will enable them to access market opportunities. And there you're looking very much for entrepreneurial businesses. You're looking for those that have the appetite to growth, who are willing to formalize, who are willing to engage in the kind of activities that make you eligible to access market opportunities. And by doing that, you then create the demand for jobs and skills. So you have to, the demand is not obvious, it's not there, it's not visible. You have to create the demand. And I agree that the growth factor, the growth from the bottom of the, if you want to say the bottom of the pyramid, the growth of those SMEs, those entrepreneurial SMEs in the townships, will enable us to increase the demand for skills and jobs in the communities where young people live. So they don't have to travel far to go, as Anne has mentioned. You don't have to spend lots of money going and looking for jobs in the cities, in the inner cities, for jobs that don't exist. And then I think the last part on the reform side is now how do we line up the supply to meet that demand? And that requires working with our public institutions in particular, and in our respect, in our work, particularly our public TVET colleges, to be able to respond to that demand in a much more dynamic way, not through qualifications primarily. There's nothing wrong with qualifications per se, but qualifications are not going to equal jobs. So how do we respond in ways that we can provide shorter, more demand-led, more responsive programs that are linked to the jobs? So the jobs come first, and I think that's where I do agree with Anne. The jobs come first, the qualifications can follow. But if we only focus on the qualifications, we don't convert those to jobs easily. So we can achieve much more scale, and we can do it in a much more resource effective manner by providing shorter courses that are more linked to jobs, preparing young people more effectively for access into those jobs.
Sure.
And then getting them on a pathway in terms of career progression and learning towards qualifications over time.
Thanks for that, Anthony. You've set us on a very nice tone, actually, understanding the status quo and where the environment is at the moment, and most importantly, how best to capitalize on the solutions and potential opportunities that do exist. So we'll come to those in just a moment. But Tash, I want to come to you, as Anthony has highlighted the formal sector. Yes for Youth. 900 companies, 35,000 employment opportunities that have been created. So the numbers do prove a sense of success, but how has this performed, especially in light of COVID-19, the pressures that corporate business is under, and the sustainability of these particular job creation opportunities, as Anthony's highlighted? Where are we in the mix of things, and how has 2020 really shifted the landscape in terms of job opportunities for youth?
So just an update on the number.
Oh,
it's
sure.
1,150 companies, and I think today we hit 40,000 work opportunities. So these are
That's well received, by the way. I think after all the negativity we've seen in the employment numbers, we need some sense of optimism.
No, it's a very exciting number for us. Look, companies continued to register during COVID. They just delayed the placement of youth because interviews are difficult, etc. But we definitely have seen research. We've seen trading updates from a couple of companies that are saying, they're 70 to 90% of trading in the same week last year. Yeah. So I do think the economy is starting to rebound. We can't ignore the NIDSCRAM survey, which is saying 2.8 million job losses. And it has dented us, but there is definitely, when Anne talks about reform, when Anne talks about the need for government to be able to create policy changes that drive the creation of work experiences. I think YES is a lovely example. We would never be able to reach the numbers that we have. 40,000 work opportunities in 21 months of operational work, with headwinds in the economy that have really been difficult. In negative economic growth, to create work opportunities is hard, but we've been able to do it because of the BEE level, which is a reward that a company can receive in return for creating this. So, it takes cognizance of the fact that businesses, as Anthony pointed out, are struggling to survive. And it's a much more sustainable model if the reforms and the policy changes recognize this and say, how do we drive this in a way that works for both parties? So the reward or incentive of a BEE or even 2 BEE levels helps us to continue to create jobs even when the conditions are not great. It would be a lot easier if we had economic growth. It would be a lot easier if we had reforms on certain laws. Imagine, everything Anthony said was so spot on, and it's lovely when you're on a panel and you agree completely with the other panelists, because that means there's, there's the same mindset
Yes.
with people who are working in the space, and that's what you want, because the answers are not that hard. You need to make it easier for small businesses to invest in innovation, become more capital intensive, and then they'll take more young people on. The most likely place for a young person to get that first experience is through the YES initiative and also through small business. We've done 40,000, but the literature tells us that if a young person, and if we start questioning everybody on this panel, my first job was at my dad's practice. My second job was waitressing for a student in my class who used to rent us out at dental school. My husband's first job was at an ice cream parlor. So we all have those first work experiences where we understand what the world of work is about at a small business. Why aren't we making it easier for small businesses to hire people? We saw a lovely policy change in Australia that reduced the red tape, the labor regulations just for small business, and in a short space of time saw 77,000 jobs being created.
Sure.
So there are examples of reforms and policy changes around the world where you can support certain sectors and drive that kind of mass job creation that Annie's talking about.
I'd like to throw in a caveat there, and of course putting on a South African lens to it, given that we have very different socioeconomic dynamics versus the likes of Australia. But in terms of the sustainability of the program and potential reforms that we need to implement, how would you see that being unfolded in South Africa to ensure that corporates can still be involved, we still create new opportunities for jobs in new spaces, but it's sustainable and does speak to the socioeconomic dynamics of a very vast landscape that we have in South Africa?
So, I mean, you mentioned that Australia has different socioeconomic dynamics, but any successful country that you look at, these are cross-country studies.
Sure.
The small business sector is the biggest driver of jobs, GDP, no matter where you look. In the EU, it's something like 90% of jobs are coming from small businesses. So these numbers are powerful no matter where you go. If you look at the way some YES corporates are placing youth, they aren't placing them in Sandton and Cape Town. They're making use of a model we have called an implementation partner model, where youth are being trained and placed by agencies that operate in communities on the ground. So these operate in early childhood development, in the healthcare space. So we've had lots of YES youth through the Aurum Institute, for example, be trained even in COVID on tracking, tracing, testing, in a range of spaces. So these are beautiful jobs, they're social jobs, they have an impact on the community through the type of training and the service that the youth is delivering. And there's the double win, because the youth's also getting an income that is being earned at local level and spent at local level. So you're creating a lot of economic dynamism when you're able to support those jobs at community level. Now, yes, it is a one-year work experience. The absorption rate moves between 22% and 30%. But what a lot of research tells us is as soon as the next employer sees a CV and reference letter that has some experience on it,
Sure.
it changes the likelihood of that young person getting the next opportunity. So it breaks the psychological barrier that a youth has about stepping into the workplace. Anne has described how many young people come from homes where there's no working adult. Right? And so it breaks that psychological barrier that I am worthy, I can get a job. It breaks the scarring effect. We know that the longer you're out of employment, the longer it takes to get back in. And globally, we've seen that employers are very hesitant to employ from the pool of the unemployed, because they see it as a marker for not being productive. But if they know you're employed or you're in the pool of people who have been employed, they see a productivity marker there. So that 1 year is a good trampoline
A good trampoline and one that is needed. And in my mind, I'm already thinking, Kuben, about the data that we saw for the unemployment figures for the second quarter, where economically inactive individuals increased significantly purely because of the lockdown regulations. And I'm imagining that given the companies that you provide staff for through Harambee as a youth employment accelerator program, a number of some of your participants and members of the program might have been impacted by some of these figures. What insight can you share with us in terms of the reality on the ground there before we talk about how we move this forward, given potential reforms as well as ongoing growth?
Absolutely, Google. Absolutely. I think what we've seen before, at the start of this year in 2020, was that there were 5.8 million young people in employment before COVID. But in fact, in 2009, at the end of the kind of last crisis that we had, there were still only 5.8 million young people employed. So in fact, that number hasn't increased in the last 11 years. And now in COVID, we've seen that in the 2.2 million jobs that were lost, almost half of that were young people. So 1 million jobs from youth were lost. 2/3 of that was women. And so what we're seeing, I think, in the last crisis and in this crisis was that young people are typically in the crisis at the front of the door on the way out. And when we do recover, as we've seen in the lack of increase in jobs for young people over the last 11 years, is that young people are at the back of the queue when there's jobs. And so I think systemically, we can all agree there's many barriers in front of the young people that we find. Now, of course, as you mentioned, with the many companies that we work with, many of them are attuned to this fact. Many of them are bought in the fact that they're using, whether it's Harambee, whether it's Yes, whether it's any of these initiatives, is that they're attuned to the problem of youth unemployment and the problem that is that we have an unequal labor market and that we have to hire inclusively. However, it's not all employers, and there's still many employers that I think don't do this. And it's often just easier, I think, for employers to hire either who comes through the door through a recommendation or just mitigate for risk by hiring the young person who has some sort of work experience. And so I think Tash's point is spot on in that a young person with some work experience has a far higher chance of getting into the formal economy. And so we're seeing that play out in that when kind of jobs were lost in lockdown, most of that were young people. And now the work that we are trying to do, not just as Harambee, but I think as all of the partners, as part of the broader, what we call the Presidential Youth Employment Intervention, is just in working with these employers in trying to say, how do we put the focus back squarely on young people? And so as we plan for a recovery of the economy, that young people can be at the front of that queue.
I'd like to tie it back to an earlier question by Anthony and get your feedback as well in terms of this conversation, Botshabelo, in terms of creating the jobs first so that the youth then follow through. The formal sector has certainly contributed and, of course, established a firm set of grounding. But as has been highlighted, it's not about qualifications, but also expanding into skills and a labour-intensive society that we need within South Africa's respects. But Botshabelo, I'd like to come to you firstly by getting some feedback in terms of vocational training, which has been met with a lot of scepticism and criticism in South Africa. I see some questions that have already popped in from some of the participants. And one of the fundamental things they ask is, what about expanding vocational training in schools and ensuring that there isn't a sense of shame might not be the right word, but less glamour to it than having a BCom degree, so to speak, for one to work in the more formal economy? What are our efforts in terms of vocational training and maybe advancing them more significantly?
Thank you very much, Kuku. I think firstly I need to agree with what Anthony was saying in terms of skills demand and supply and demand. Mm-hmm. The biggest challenge of our vocational education and training system is that what the TVET system is supplying is not what the industry is looking for. Mm-hmm. Might be supplying a lot of qualification, but that's not what the industry is looking for. So the skills that the youth are getting out of the TVET colleges are not matching what the industry wants. So there is a skills mismatch. Then at the core of that is basically a lack of social dialogue between the TVET college and the industry. So we need to get the TVET colleges understanding what the local industry need. We are talking about district development model, where in each district there should be a vocational training institute, whether it's a school or a TVET college. But what is the point if it cannot supply the skills that are needed by the industry at that sector? It becomes something that young people don't even want to go to, because they end up being unemployed, coming up with those qualifications, whether it's diploma or certificate, they are still unemployable. So there is a gap in terms of what the industry need and what the vocational education is providing.
Then the obvious question is, how do we fix that? Surely at some point a conversation needs to take place, but again, there appears to be a misalignment. Open question, but go ahead and respond.
How we need to fix that? The Minister of Higher Education has launched the Centers of Specialization, which is an initiative at TVET colleges working with the industry association within a TVET colleges, where a cluster of employers within a TVET colleges will form a forum. In some countries, they call it the cluster, the cluster or association, where they will say, these are the skills that we need from this TVET college. And from the government side, you then need to capacitate the TVET college in terms of infrastructure, in terms of the skills of the people that are there, so that they are able to deliver there. So 2019, the minister launched this 26 centers. We are getting quite a good response from the industry that is starting to participate. It's starting to bridge the gap, because they start off a talk between what a TVET college need to provide, what are the skills that the industry need. I fully agree that most of the job creation is not with the big sector. It's with the SMEs. And where are the SMEs? They are where the TVET colleges are, but mostly they don't know what's happening at the TVET college, and the TVET college does not know what is the need. They just go to and offer what has been called ministerial program or program qualification mix, which is drawing from the basket that has always been there. But we know that is not addressing the need. We are just creating a pool of a lot of unemployed young people that cannot get a formal employment, that cannot create their own jobs, because their skills is irrelevant to what the industry needs. So we need to start engaging more and more, and the industry need to engage through this district development model, through this center of specialization model, where they are given a seat at the college, and they are in the driving seat, because without the industry, who are you training for? Especially if you are talking about vocational education, you're supposed to be training for the industry, because even if you want to start your own business in that sector, you should have got the skill yourself, that you have learned the skill. If you want to start a plumbing business, you should have been able to then get some form of skills within the plumbing sector. So that is the area that we need to focus on, and bring the industry to be at the driver's seat within the TVET sector.
Sure. Starts with the conversation and ongoing engagement and interactions. And I think there are opportunities for us to learn from the formal sector as to what it is they're doing in terms of making sure that there is a tick box exercise to cross-examine features. Anthony, you've got some feedback?
Yeah, but I think we also have to change the nature of the debate and look at the problem a little bit differently, because I think the Centers of Specialization project, which is really focused on artisan training and qualifications for high-level industry is a great initiative, but it's always going to only reach a limited number of young people. Our artisan training has always been historically and continues to be very expensive. It's very resource intensive. It requires workplaces that are very well equipped to train. It's very regulated and et cetera, et cetera. So the challenge is that we have large numbers of young people going into our TVET college system every year. We know that there's issues with quality of teaching and et cetera. But the bigger problem is that those that are coming out, very few of them are going to access the artisan training system. So the question is, what are the other opportunities that exist for those large numbers of young people who are not going to get into artisan training? And I think that's where we need to look at the argument, because we have to be able to expand the pathways, the learning pathways and employment pathways that are available for young people that are going into the colleges. And that requires a different interrogation, as I said, of where the jobs are and what are the types of skills that we need to prepare young people for those jobs. And I think that where we continue to go into the same thing, and I think again it links to some of what Anne was saying, is that we keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result.
Sure.
And we're not getting a different result. So we're spending an incredible amount of money every year that we don't necessarily have to train young people through these qualifications, whether they're apprenticeships, learnerships, driven by the wrong sort of imperatives. So we know that there's a lot of money spent by companies on that type of training because they need to meet their triple B scorecards, because they need to use their skills development levies and these sorts of things. But these are not translating into jobs. We're finding increasingly that there's a lot of, not a lot, but we're seeing that there's artisans out there who are unemployed because there's an oversupply in certain trades. And we keep talking about shortage of artisans, but the reality is that artisans are not getting employed necessarily because companies can't afford to employ them. So they can train them because there's incentives. They can train them on apprenticeships. They can train them on learnerships because there's incentives to do that. But they can't necessarily employ them afterwards. So they can release them and then bring in a new crop, and the process starts all over again. Now, if you happen to be entrepreneurial and you're a young person and you're really entrepreneurial, then yes, you can go and start your own plumbing business or electrical business or whatever it is. But as Anne said, it's very few and far between young people that can do that. So it becomes a question of now putting a lot of money into training that does not lead necessarily to jobs.
That almost makes me think of the chicken and egg scenario, because we refer to this SMME pool that will essentially absorb some members of the labor force, but yet there is a dwindling number of individuals who might actually become entrepreneurial and be the leaders within the SMME realm. So how do we begin by creating this market? Kuben, perhaps if you can start and open to the panel as well in terms of how do we then create this market for the jobs that we're looking for and then dribble that down into the skills that might be required to fulfill those jobs?
Absolutely. So Anne was right in that entrepreneurship is not the answer, but if I can add a bit more color to that, the majority of young people are really at the bottom of the ladder, because entrepreneurship is a spectrum. In fact, almost 3 million young people are in what we call hustling. They're doing a little piece jobs, side jobs. They are learning how to kind of do makeup or hairdressing or provide services or sell goods in their communities. And they're earning income in that way. But there's no support there. All of the resources and the support is for more established micro to small, medium enterprises and more established entrepreneurs. In fact, what we've learned can be successful is that you talk to a young person. Firstly, help them understand that in fact, hustling and earning an income this way is actually a viable and lucrative opportunity, and that there's opportunities at the end of that. All you need is agency and will. And then you can help that young person understand what some of these opportunities. And so we've had a bit of a model that says we can go into some of these communities, offer these young people stipends, and then work with them in a period of 4 weeks to help them formulate a little bit of a plan to take those stipends, create a little business for themselves, maybe selling goods, buying in bulk, selling it to their community, and then earning a profit off of that.
Sure.
And then after that, starting to learn the skills to make that more sustainable. Now, we've seen that a portion of those young people can actually graduate to higher levels of entrepreneurship. One of those young women, Kanisile, in fact, she's a great example, who then graduated. She formed an early childhood development center. She started hiring more young people in community. She won a 10,000 Rand grant for entrepreneurship, eventually about 6 months later, since the program started. Now, of course, people like Kanyisila are also few and far between, but now we can start understanding that getting young people busy, helping them earn an income is also work experience that can be counted towards the formal economy and formal opportunities as well. And if we can crowd in more resources, more support at that bottom of the micro enterprise ladder, I think we can scale up a lot more opportunities for young people, because young people have the answers. We just need to enable and support them to be able to create those opportunities for themselves.
Makes a lot of sense. Tash, go ahead.
You know, what we're hearing is everybody's got valid ideas on how you can do this. There's no one solution. It's the and and the and and the and. This idea of young people getting that work experience and using that to follow an entrepreneurial path. It's very hard to go straight into your own business when you've never worked in a business. And so that work experience is a lovely place to test and understand the systems that are needed in a business, to learn the skills that may be necessary if you're able to intern at a hairdresser, for example, or in the healthcare space, whatever it may be. The idea of incubation. We've spoken to a few incubator heads, and they say there are so many super young people with great ideas, but the time it takes to learn how to run that business, they give up on the idea because they need to put bread on the table. So that 1 year paid work experience can also be your incubation period, where you have the safety and security of enough food to keep your family going, while you experiment with the idea of running your own business. And we also need to distinguish between levels of entrepreneurship. You know, there's the unicorn, the people that are going to be starting the Airbnbs of this world, and there's also the mom and pop store.
Yep.
And the mom and pop store doesn't sound sexy, but these are the businesses that will employ 5 people, that will keep their kids in school with that little grocery store that they have on the corner. So, and what you need for those sorts of entrepreneurs to survive is a very different ecosystem or support system than you need for those high end. So, you know, we also throw money at entrepreneurship programs in this country. And I don't know that, I think we're going OTT on what we need to build around some of them. Sometimes it's just the basic technical skills and the psychological support of those first few months when, you know, you hit the wall and the money going out is a little bit more than the money coming in. Some of that bridging finance, managing anxiety, psychological support with small entrepreneurs is as important as capital into that business. So there's the and what Anthony is saying is also, you know, it doesn't have to be this 3-year qualification.
Yes.
Micro-credentialing and starting to give young people at school an idea of the micro-credentials and the range of opportunities that are available to them. So these are all things I think we have an idea on, but we need to do better.
And I think that, sorry.
Go ahead, Anthony. We'll come to some.
From that, because I think that there's the idea of how you start someone on a journey. What are the minimum interventions you need to do to start someone on a journey? Give them that first entry point. Let them experience and learn on the job. And then from there you can take them that one step further. And particularly in the SME environment, because, you know, as Tasha said, I mean, starting an SME is not easy, and sustaining an SME is even harder. So understanding what it means to work in an SME environment, going into a micro business and getting your work experience and learning under the mentorship of a business owner in a micro business, in a small business, is invaluable. And you can be learning the technical skills as well as learning what it means to actually be able to be self-employed or to set up. So I think that first, but you need to just find that small slice of what it takes to get them from where they are in terms of their formative education, and their vocational education. What is that minimum that you need to do to prepare them to go into that workplace, so you can give them that first entry point?
Yes.
And then start them in that process of learning on the job, being mentored, being exposed to the world of what it means to actually run that business.
I'm glad you highlight that. And Sabelo, I'm keen to hear your views because it does seem as though it's not just the maths and science will get you into the medicine or BCom accounting stream, as well as technical drawing will get you into more of the technical work, but really a culmination of it all, including important life skills. As we know, entrepreneurship challenges a wide variety of one's thinking and even personal behavior. And that does speak to how we approach it from a higher education and training point of view, also almost in terms of developing and imparting life skills together with the entrepreneurial skills that are required, as well as the skills for the physical job that these entrepreneurs, or rather young South Africans, will be participating in.
That is correct. I think we also need to redefine the concept of apprenticeship so that we don't limit it to blue-collar occupations. We need to look on issues like hairdressing, the issues are around hospitality. There are occupations around that where one can enter into that and be able to create employment at a very early age. So those are the areas that we need to see. How do we expand? How do we bring the SMEs within those areas? So that, because the key thing, I think what has been brought by my colleagues is to say, how do we get that first step there, that first employment within the hospitality? What kinds of skills are needed there? If we are not providing that within our TVET sector, then we are going to have this disjuncture between what's happening in our local district and what the TVET sector is providing. So we need to expand this concept of vocational education. We also need to look on part qualification, because it doesn't mean that if you are getting into a plumbing, you can't just be getting into that so that you just get a part qualification so that you can install solar geysers, for example.
Sure.
But you are doing a plumbing qualification that as you get opportunities, you are able then to expand. As you are getting more exposure, you are able to acquire more skills. So we don't need to limit it and make this big animal that once you are there, you only need to take 3-4 years and you need big industry to do that. Small industries should be able to do that as long as there's that discussion between the industry and the TVET colleges or the vocational institutions within the sector. That will be able to assist us in changing the perception and the face of the TVET colleges so that they become institutions of choice for young people rather than being something that they fall on if they have not been accepted at universities. So we got this challenge that our education pyramid is quite wrong because it's having many students at universities and less at TVET colleges. So we send many students to universities, and then those that don't get access, they only fall to TVET colleges. So our enrollment at 26 universities is more than the enrollment at 50 TVET colleges, which is a misnomer.
Something that obviously needs to change in terms of perception, as mentioned earlier, in terms of graduates preferring to have some kind of degree versus a skill that they can work on. But I do want to shift this slightly. We are all gathered here in the heart of Johannesburg, Gauteng, the richest province on the continent. And perhaps these conversations might be easy to implement and transition from conversation, concept, and then implement on the ground. So, but in more rural areas of South Africa's communities, we clearly need to take on a very different approach. And I'm intrigued to understand, if we should, and in particular, what kind of view there, tying it into the comments that were mentioned by Anne earlier regarding the public works program that should be implemented, and most importantly, providing scale for increasing job opportunities. Open question to the panel. Do we need, and are there lessons perhaps that each of you have learned in terms of your actions as to the differences between urban, peri-urban and more rural areas, how best we need to approach job creation skills there?
So, I mean, in the case of yes, I'll describe some of the rural jobs that have been created through the program. We created partnerships. I think the trick is that you want to build platforms and partnerships These partnerships we established looked at sectors in those particular rural communities that we felt there would be scope for job growth. So for example, in Mpumalanga, the Yes Youth that are placed up there are in rhino protection programs, learning game ranging, in the hospitality industry. Of course, you can imagine COVID has hit us a little bit hard up in that province with our jobs, but our partners have been strong enough to keep those youth in those opportunities. But what it means is if they're getting trained in the types of sectors that have economic hooks, the economy of the Kruger Park is a huge economy. That means that after the year-long work experience, it is far more likely that those youth get absorbed into a second opportunity. The youth that are in KwaZulu-Natal, many of them are sponsored by ABSA and Nedbank. We've got them in the Midlands, in farming projects, the youth with Nestlé, clear non-indigenous species out of the land, wattle specifically. The clearing of wattle by these youth in their youth jobs has meant the river systems have started to flow. They then process the wattle, so they're entrepreneurs in training. They process the wattle to turn it into cattle feed, and they sell that back to Nestlé.
Wow.
So Nestlé is doing their Yes Youth in a beautiful little cycle.
Shared value.
That's exactly. That means those jobs have legs even after the year, but they're adding value to Nestlé in two ways, both in terms of their scorecard. And Anthony's right, if you are going to be perverse about the scorecard and do it for points, it's not going to get our country much further. But if you think carefully about an integrated scorecard and real authentic impact with it, it's a beautiful tool to take a company's spend and really drive it towards broad-based empowerment. And those are the kinds of projects where rural, so the city guys can fund rural jobs that matter.
Great cohesiveness between the ecosystem. Anthony, you'd like to add?
Even in the rural areas, as Tasha said, there are opportunities to link your formal sector with your village economy, because obviously, particularly, so I'll talk about the work that we're doing in the Ilembe district, working with large businesses in that area who have lots of communities on their fence line, communities, and you can talk to a number of smaller towns and rural settings that have this sort of scenario where you have large industries that have large communities that surround them and are under pressure to engage with those communities around market activity and empowerment, and struggle to do that. There's a real struggle in terms of their ability to reach out and work with communities in a sustainable and an empowering sort of manner. So how you facilitate the linkages between those larger industries and the township businesses or the village businesses, is quite a key sort of mechanism, because from a localization point of view, from a BBBE point of view, from whichever lens you want to use it, that mechanism becomes a critical enabler in terms of cohesion, in terms of local economic development, and all sorts of things. And I think that it's identifying the demand, how you can unlock the demand for those township enterprises through the larger businesses that you're working with. What is the nature of that demand? And through that, you can then bring those township businesses into that market activity, support them to be able to grow through that process, to develop through that process, and through that then have the knock-on effect of unlocking the demand for skills and jobs in those communities. So it's a kind of a it has it's a sort of a
Spillover effect.
Spillover or circular effect that requires you to work within that local ecosystem to identify how those linkages can be supported.
And I mean, this point Anthony's making, we've got lots of examples of governments that have used this anchor tenant, this anchor industry. The South Koreans have created what they call creative councils. They've got this big anchor company that does this knowledge spillover to all of the smaller businesses, and that's how they create clusters. So you see that in a lot of countries. We haven't been able to use our private sector to deliver that kind of spillover of knowledge, and it's something we really should explore.
To wrap up with, I realize we've got 2.5 minutes, and I'm hoping we can tie this into some of your closing remarks before we do rush off to a tea break. In terms of the realistic outlook for South Africa's economy, growth is going to be a challenge, and reforms, as we mentioned, is going to be a tough element for government to implement, but of course needs the buy-in of all stakeholders. And that leads to the reality on the ground that things are going to be tougher than what they currently are. And we need to gear up for that particular battle. We've sourced solutions using the current elements that you've highlighted in terms of the innovations and successes that you've shared regarding your jobs. But as we move forward, for youth, for business, for government, as well as labor, what are the key number one priorities that we need to be sure to implement? And I think that will be the parting shot from each of you. If there's one thing that we can get right, whether it's in the Economic Recovery Plan or the MTBPS, to focus on creating youth employment, Kubin, from your point of view, Tash, Anthony and Sabelo, as we make our way down.
I think actually Anne Bernstein covered it really well. The biggest thing that we can do is generating more opportunities, and doing that through a systemic approach that gets us all together, but also through policy reform. And so, I mean, if we had to pick one thing, it is about opportunities. But in this recovery plan, as we're talking about it now, is putting youth at the front and center so that they're not left at the back of the queue again in this crisis.
Fantastic. Tash?
Again, Anne's been in this research space for so long, so she is a font of knowledge. And her comments around the amount of money we spend through government, through our departments, to drive these things forward. The capacity, the execution capacity that we see sitting in some of those departments around getting this right. Because I think here you've heard, with Anne, you've heard, we know the things that we need to get right, but the execution on it is not happening. So if there could be stronger public-private partnerships to help in the execution of those big pots of funds, so we get more bang for buck and we can go further with it. I think that's maybe the secret to scale, is working together with them to help with the execution.
Perfect. Anthony?
And I think so. I would support both of those. And I think that leading on from that is how do we remove the barriers to growth, particularly in our informal sector? Because the only way that we're really going to grow demand and create opportunities is if we can lift that informal sector and help it to overcome many of the hurdles that it experiences in terms of growth. And only through that will we create the demand. So I think removing those, whether it's from a policy perspective, from a funding perspective, how do we remove some of those barriers on the ground that inhibit the potential of our informal sector to really grow and formalize and become part of our economy. That will unlock a whole lot of the opportunities.
Perfect. Sabelo, your closing shot?
Let's link this economic recovery plan and strategic integrated projects that are being revised to different needs of the industry and the local community. And let's adjust our institutions to provide necessary skills.
Fantastic. So localization and, of course, addressing it in terms of policy, more public-private partnerships, especially when it comes to mobilizing capital effectively and removing barriers to economic growth. A big thank you to my panelists for joining us. I think it was an invigorating conversation which really sets the tone and the theme for the breakaway rooms, which will commence shortly. So thank you for your feedback and participation. Greatly appreciated in terms of the contribution you've made today. Well, for you at home who are all excited and, of course, have been sharing your feedback with us, the chat service and the Q&A has been incredibly busy. You can continue to participate. But before we let you go to the separate breakaway sessions, which we'll move into very briefly, there are 3 breakaway sessions that will be taking place, one of which will be held here and moderated by Kathy Duff of Trilog. But we just want to get your quick response and feedback as to which particular breakaway sessions you'll be attending. And of course, you've got one of 3 options there: preparing youth through vocational training, youth skills development, or youth training. Hold on. Have we got the right questions on screen? Yes, we do. I've got different questions on my end, but quick questions that we want to double check with you in terms of preparing youth for employment, developing young entrepreneurs in a disruptor economy, or of course, innovation for job creation. Quickly have a look at those polling questions and share your feedback with us. We do want to get your results in and also track where a lot of the conversation will be taking place for today. But share your feedback with us, and of course you can continue to also share some comments and questions on the chat service. There we go, a few results in. Seems as though it's a fair split, but I'll tell you what, we'll get those responses in just a moment and share them with you. But for now, though, just some insight into our breakaway panels. We're going to quickly move off the stage. The next conversation that will be held on this particular stage of the breakaway is one that focuses on preparing youth through vocational skills training. It will be taking place here. Enjoy the breakaway sessions. The next session will commence in at least the next minute.